At 6:12 in the morning, my husband used a word that changed everything. Not a cruel word, not a shout, just one quiet word tossed over his shoulder while he was already walking away. Adequate. I had spent 3 days planning his firm's anniversary dinner, contacted the caterer myself, drove to 3 different florists, because the first 2 didn't carry white ranunculus, the only flower he'd ever mentioned liking. Once, 4 years ago at someone else's wedding, I'd written and rewritten the seating chart because he told me, without looking up from his laptop, that putting certain clients near certain partners sends a message. I didn't know what message. I never knew what message. I just kept rearranging names on little cardstock rectangles until something felt right. The dinner had gone perfectly. His partners complimented the venue. One of his biggest clients pulled me aside and said it was the best event the firm had ever hosted. That morning, I asked him, quietly over coffee, what he thought. He said, adequate, and walked out the door. I stood in our kitchen in Scottsdale. The kitchen with the double ovens I'd chosen, and the quartzite countertops he'd approved, and the window that looked out over a backyard I'd designed, and never once sat in. And I thought, I don't remember the last time I did something he considered more than adequate. My name is Lydia. I was 38 years old. I had been married to my husband, a real estate development attorney named Spencer, for 11 years. We had a house in a gated community, 2 cars in a 3-car garage, a joint investment account, and a marriage that had slowly, quietly, become something I didn't recognize. I want to be fair to the beginning. Spencer was not a monster in the beginning. He was driven and exacting, and he paid attention to details in a way that felt, early on, like caring. When we first dated, he remembered that I took my coffee with oat milk before oat milk was everywhere. He noticed when I'd had a hard day before I said anything. He planned things carefully. Our first vacation, our first apartment, the proposal. And at 27, I mistook precision for devotion. What I didn't understand then was that there is a version of control that masquerades as love for years before you can see it clearly. It started small. He preferred I not talk about my job. I was a freelance graphic designer at his firm events because it confused people when they tried to place me. He had opinions about how I dressed that he framed as helpful observations. He didn't like when I made plans with my sister Gwen on weeknights because he might come home early and want company. He didn't like when I made plans on weekends because that was our time. And I accommodated, I adjusted, I got smaller. By the time I was 35, I had let most of my freelance clients go because he'd mentioned once, neutrally, that it seemed stressful for me and that we didn't need the income. By 37, I was clearing my social calendar past 9 p.m. because he slept lightly and the sound of the garage woke him. By 38, I was calling ranunculus florists at 8 in the morning and being told my contribution was adequate. The word sat in my chest for 2 days like a splinter. On the 3rd day, I drove to my mother's house in Tempe without telling him where I was going. Not because I was hiding, just because. I realized in the car, hands on the wheel, I couldn't remember the last time I'd gone somewhere without filing a mental report. My mother made iced tea and we sat on her back porch and I said, "Mom, I think I've been disappearing." She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "I know, sweetheart. I've been watching it happen for 6 years, and I didn't know how to say it." I cried on her porch for about 40 minutes. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and overdue, the way certain things finally fall when they've been balanced wrong for too long. She asked me what I wanted, not what I was going to do, just what I wanted. I told her I wanted to feel like a person again. When I got home that evening, Spencer was already there, which was unusual. He was in the kitchen eating takeout he'd ordered for himself. He hadn't ordered for me. He looked up when I came in and said, "Where were you?" I said, "At my mother's." He said, "You should have texted." Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "I was worried." Just the correction, just the expectation that I had failed some procedure. I said, "You're right, I'll remember next time," but I was already thinking there might not be a next time. Not like this. The shift inside me was quiet. I didn't announce it. I didn't start arguments. I started paying attention. I'd always handled our household finances. Spencer was busy, he said, and he trusted me, he said, though he also required I run large purchases by him, and had once gone cold for 3 days because I bought a piece of art for the living room without asking first. I pulled up our accounts more carefully now. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I was just looking. What I found over about 3 weeks of careful review was a pattern I couldn't explain. There was a credit card I didn't know about, not in a joint account, in his name only, with a billing address that was his office. Monthly charges, restaurants I'd never been to, 2 to 3 times a week. A hotel in downtown Phoenix, checked in on a Tuesday in March, checked out on a Thursday. Another hotel stay in Sedona in May. Charges at a spa in Scottsdale I didn't recognize. I sat with the statements for a long time. I didn't want to be wrong. I also knew I wasn't wrong. I called my college roommate Becca, who is now a family law attorney in Denver. We hadn't spoken in almost 2 years because Spencer found her a lot, and I had quietly let the friendship thin. I called her on a Tuesday afternoon from a coffee shop 2 miles from our house because I no longer fully trusted the walls at home. She answered on the second ring. I said, "Becca, I need your help and I need you to not be surprised that I'm asking." She said, "I have been waiting for this call." Over the next hour, she walked me through everything. What to document and how, what to preserve, what to move carefully, and what not to touch. She referred me to a family law attorney in Scottsdale she trusted, a woman named she described as direct, meticulous, and excellent in mediation. She told me the most important thing I could do right now was to stop making financial moves he'd notice and start making financial moves he wouldn't. I asked her if she thought I was overreacting. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "You're calling me from a coffee shop because you don't trust your own house." No, Lydia, you are not overreacting. I drove home and made dinner and ate with Spencer and smiled when he talked about a deal closing and asked questions at the right moments. I was already somewhere else. I had started to leave and he didn't know it yet. What followed was 2 months of the most careful work I've ever done. I opened a personal checking account at a bank I'd never used. I had a small amount of inheritance money from my grandmother sitting in an account Spencer had never asked about. He'd been incurious about it in a way that now felt deliberate, and I moved it into the new account quietly. I started keeping copies of documents, tax returns, mortgage statements, investment account records, his firm's founding agreement, which I'd signed a spousal acknowledgement on years ago without fully understanding what I was acknowledging. My new attorney, whose name I won't share here, was methodical in a way that calmed me down. She told me what the credit card statements could and couldn't prove. She explained the difference between what was legal and what was strategic. She told me about Arizona community property law. I learned things about my own marriage I had never known to ask. I also, slowly, began reconnecting. I texted Gwen and asked if I could come over for dinner on a Friday. I told Spencer I had plans. Not where, not with whom, just plans. He gave me a look that lasted about 3 seconds too long and then said, "Fine." It was the first time in years I'd said I had plans without a full accounting and felt the word hold. My sister opened the door with a hug that lasted longer than usual, the way people hug you when they've been worried and they're relieved you showed up. She didn't push. We made pasta together and talked about her kids, and somewhere in the middle of dinner she put her hand over mine and said, "You seem a little more like yourself." I said, "I'm working on it." I told her enough that she understood. She didn't panic. She asked what she could do. I told her for now just this: dinner, normalcy, the reminder that there was a life outside the house in the gated community with the quartzite countertops. She said, "Anytime. Every week if you need it." I needed it more than I knew. The night things changed. Or rather, the night I decided the timeline was no longer mine to manage alone, was an ordinary Wednesday. Spencer came home late, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that he was in a good mood. He poured himself a glass of bourbon, offered me one, which he rarely did, and sat across from me in the living room and was almost warm, conversational. He asked about my week. He mentioned, almost offhand, that a colleague of his had recently separated from his wife and it had been messy and expensive, and that he was glad, he said, that we were not those people. He looked at me when he said it. Directly, steadily, I looked back and said, "Me too," and I thought, he's not reassuring himself. He's reassuring me. He knows something has shifted and he's trying to find the edges of it without asking directly. 2 weeks later, I was ready. My attorney had everything organized. I'd had a conversation with a financial advisor she recommended about what equitable division would look like given Arizona's community property laws. I had 6 months of credit card statements printed, organized, and stored at Gwen's house. I had copies of every document I gathered on a flash drive at my mother's house and another set in my attorney's office. I had also, quietly, located an apartment, a one-bedroom in the Arcadia neighborhood, near a coffee shop I'd always loved and a bookstore I used to go to before I'd stopped going places alone. My mother co-signed the lease. I gave the management office her address. Spencer would not have a forwarding address until my attorney made the filing. The movers came on a Thursday morning, while Spencer was at a deposition he'd mentioned on Sunday. I had confirmed it was still happening. 3 hours, downtown, starting at 9, without asking him directly. I knew his schedule the way you know the habits of whether you've lived inside for years. I had made a list, not of everything, of what was mine. The things I brought into the marriage, the things I'd bought with money that was mine, the furniture from my grandmother's house that I'd stored in the 3rd bedroom for 4 years because Spencer found it too lived in for the main rooms. The art I'd bought before I learned to ask permission, my grandmother's writing desk, which I had kept in the corner of a room we used for nothing, and which Spencer had suggested, more than once, donating. The movers were professional and fast. My neighbor from 2 doors down, a woman named Terry who had never liked Spencer and had told me so with her eyes at every homeowners association meeting for 3 years, came over and stood in the driveway and told the movers which truck bay to use. She had offered without being asked. She just showed up that morning with coffee and said, "Tell me what you need." By 1 o'clock, everything was loaded. I went through the house one more time. I stood in the kitchen with the double ovens. I stood at the window over the backyard I'd never sat in. I stood in the doorway of the room where my grandmother's desk had been for 4 years and looked at the rectangle of clean carpet where it had stood. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and waited. Spencer came home at 3:47. I know because I checked the time when I heard the garage door. He came through the door and stopped. You could see it move through him. The recognition that something was wrong in the way a house feels wrong. Before you've identified what's missing. His eyes went to the living room first, where the art was gone. Then to the hallway. Then to me. He said, "What is this?" I said, "Please sit down." He didn't sit down. He said, "Lydia, what did you do?" I said, "I'm filing for divorce. My attorney will be in touch with yours by end of business tomorrow. You'll find the paperwork on the counter by the coffee maker." He stared at me. I had expected anger. What I got, for about 15 seconds, was nothing. Just a kind of recalculating silence. The same silence he used before responding in negotiations. He was figuring out his position. Then he said, "You don't want to do this." Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "Can we talk?" Just the certainty that he knew what I wanted better than I did. I said, "I've been planning this for 2 months. I'm quite sure I want to do this." He said, "Where are you going to go?" I said, "That's already handled." he said, Lydia, and his voice shifted into something softer, something I recognized as the register he used when he wanted something. We can work this out, whatever you think you found, I said. My attorney has everything she needs. I'd recommend you call yours tonight. I stood up. I picked up my bag. I looked at him, really looked, the way you finally look at something you've been seeing around for years. And I said, I hope the next part of your life is better than you made ours. Then I walked out the front door. The apartment in Arcadia was small in the way that felt correct. A bed I'd chosen. A couch that was mine. My grandmother's desk in the corner of the living room, finally out of the third bedroom, finally in light. I sat at that desk the first night and I didn't do anything. I just sat there. The lamp was warm. Outside, someone was walking a dog. A car passed. Ordinary sounds, the kind I hadn't noticed in years because I'd been too busy listening for footsteps upstairs. Wen brought dinner that first night. My mother brought towels and a plant she said was impossible to kill. Becca called from Denver, and we talked for 2 hours about nothing and everything, the way we used to in college. Terry texted, "How's the new place?" I said, "It feels like mine." The mediation process took 4 months. Spencer arrived at the first session with a posture that suggested he expected this to be brief. His attorney was a man I didn't know. Mine was steady and prepared in a way that left no room for improvisation. Spencer's attorney challenged the credit card evidence. My attorney had already anticipated this. She had traced 2 of the charges to a woman who was a commercial real estate consultant, someone whose name appeared in Spencer's firm's intake files, someone whose professional relationship with my husband appeared to have begun around the same time the hotel stays did. We didn't need to prove the affair to reach a fair settlement under Arizona law, but having the documentation meant that Spencer's attorney had to make a choice about how aggressively to proceed. They chose not to be aggressive. We reached a settlement over 3 sessions. Under Arizona community property law, marital assets are divided equitably. The house, the joint investment accounts, the retirement contributions made during the marriage. My attorney had documented everything carefully. Spencer kept the house, which he had wanted. I received my portion of equity, my share of the investments, and a structured settlement for the 11 years during which I had supported his career advancement while limiting my own earning capacity. It was fair. More than fair, actually. One of the final things on the settlement list was a piece of art. A small oil painting I'd bought at a gallery in Sedona before we were married. Worth maybe $3,000. Spencer had hung it in his office at home, and it had been there so long it had started to feel like his. His attorney initially didn't flag it to be removed from the house inventory. My attorney flagged it. She had found a receipt in my name, pre-marriage, in the documentation I'd provided. She put it on the list without asking me. At the final session, when his attorney reviewed the inventory and saw it, there was a pause. Then they initialed it. I didn't react. I just noted it quietly. In that way you note the small things when everything larger has already been decided. I have the painting now. It's on the wall above my grandmother's desk. I work from that desk. I took on my first freelance client 3 weeks after moving into the apartment. A small packaging company in Tempe that needed a rebrand, then another. Then a referral from Becca, a nonprofit in Phoenix. I am not in a hurry. I am also not getting smaller. My sister calls twice a week. My mother comes for dinner on Sundays. Becca is visiting next month, and we've already made a reservation at a restaurant Spencer would have found too loud. I am 38 years old. I got smaller for a long time, quietly, in increments so small I almost didn't notice. And then one morning I stood in a kitchen where I had given 11 years and heard a single word, and something in me decided it was done being adequate. I want to say, if any of this sounds familiar, the smallness is not permanent. The adjustments you've made, the things you've stopped doing, the plans you've stopped making, those were survival. They were not sentences. The desk is in the light now. The plant my mother brought is still alive, and I am, slowly and without apology, learning to take up space again. I've thought a lot about the word adequate since that morning in the kitchen. Not with bitterness, I'm past that, but with a kind of clarity I didn't have when I was living inside it. What Spencer did wasn't dramatic. That's the part that's hardest to explain to people who haven't been through something like it. There was no single moment of cruelty I could point to. It was incremental. A preference here, a correction there, a calendar cleared by degrees, a friendship allowed to thin, a version of me that got a little quieter every year, and a version of him that never seemed to notice because quiet was what he wanted. I think about the choices I made during those 2 months. The careful ones, the documented ones, the ones I made alone in coffee shops with my phone face down on the table. Those choices didn't come from anger. They came from something I'd almost lost the name for, the understanding that I was worth more than I'd been accepting. That is not a feeling someone hands you. It is something you have to find your way back to, usually after you've wandered pretty far from it. What I know now is that the smallest decisions compound. Every time I said yes when I meant no, I was making a decision. Every time I cleared my Friday because Spencer might come home early, I was making a decision. Every time I filed a mental report before going somewhere, I was making a decision. None of those decisions felt like much in the moment. Together, over 11 years, they built a life I barely recognized as mine. And the reverse is also true. Every careful step I took, opening that account, calling Becca, having dinner at Gwen's, saying, I have plans, without a full accounting, each of those was also a decision. Small, unremarkable on its own, but they added up to a Thursday morning with movers and a 1-bedroom apartment in Arcadia, and my grandmother's desk, finally in the light. That is what I mean when I say the outcome of a life is rarely about one big moment. It's about what you keep choosing in the ordinary minutes when no one is watching and the stakes feel low. Spencer was not a stupid man. He was, in many ways, a precise and capable one. But precision in the service of control is not intelligence. It's fear wearing a very good suit. The thing he could never quite account for was that I was paying attention too. Quietly, over time, and when I finally moved, I moved completely. I don't carry anger toward him. I carry the lesson. The lesson is this: the life you accept is the life you teach people you'll accept, and the moment you stop accepting it, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly, and with documentation and a good attorney, the whole structure has to reckon with that. Terry showed up with coffee. Gwen kept the door open every Friday. My mother brought towels and a plant. Becca answered on the second ring after 2 years of silence. None of them needed to be asked twice. I used to think I had a small life because of circumstances. I know now I had a small life because I kept agreeing to it. The desk is in the light. The plant is alive. And I am not, under any definition, adequate.